Hello everyone, my name is Nick, and today I'm going to discuss with you guys my top 5 picks for large floor plants. I would argue that step 1 when creating a home jungle would be to get a floor plant, so I thought this would be an excellent topic to discuss. So I will discuss my top 5 picks for large plants. All 5 of these are ones that I've been growing in my home for at least a full growing season, so I wholeheartedly can recommend all 5 of these. I wouldn't say any of them outweigh the other. I'd say all 5 of these are excellent choices. It all just depends on the growing conditions you have in your home. The first plant I'm going to talk about today is definitely the most Instagram famous, or at least the most readily available plant, and that is none other than the Monstera deliciosa, or the split-leaf philodendron, the Mexican breadfruit plant, the Swiss cheese plant. There are so many common names for this plant. But this plant is very widely available for good reason. This plant is tough as nails. It is so easy to grow. It can withstand a large amount of light conditions. So we'll start off by talking about the light. I find that personally Monstera deliciosa appreciates brighter light conditions. I'll say that's how this plant gets these large leaves with fenestrations, which is what they refer to the inner splits in the leaves as. So the more light you give this plant, I find that this plant will get larger leaves and it will look, it'll grow to its fullest potential, which is what you want. In lower light conditions, this plant will fully survive. I find this plant will even grow in lower light, but the leaves will stay kind of small. The plant will grow a little bit more in a viney nature. And you can kind of see right here this leaf that's a little bit more underdeveloped. This is probably more of what the leaves will look like if you're growing the plant in lower light compared to these leaves that I have up here that are rather large. So lighting it can take a full spectrum of light, but I would say this plant definitely prefers to be on the brighter side of that spectrum, at least if you want it to grow to its fullest potential. As far as watering goes, it definitely depends on how much light you're giving this plant. So for example, I am growing this Monstera deliciosa in a south-facing window, which I should say is probably a little bit too much light. If I turn this plant over here, this is actually the leaf that's pressed up against the window, and you can see how it is literally burned. So south-facing light, probably a little bit too much, but I find that other than that burn mark, this plant seems to grow quite well there. But this plant is growing in a south-facing window in a terracotta pot, and this plant dries out very fast. It's receiving so much light, so I find I am watering this plant roughly once a week. However, there was another Monstera deliciosa that I had in my home. That Monstera was growing back in the plant corner where my trellis is now, that you can kind of see in the back. And that plant had been growing in a ceramic pot. It was growing roughly 10 feet away from a west-facing window, and that was much, much lower light than this plant was receiving. And it was, as I said, in a ceramic pot, which is not porous compared to terracotta, so the terracotta wicks out moisture, while the ceramic pot would hold in moisture. So that plant I found myself watering maybe every 3 or 4 weeks because it just wasn't receiving as much light and it wasn't processing the water as fast. So you'll be watering your plants basically dependent on how much light you're giving this plant, and also the potting material and the potting medium is definitely going to come into play as well. Very easy to grow, a very large spectrum of light that this plant can take, and this plant is very easy when it comes to watering. So definitely a wonderful place to start if you're looking for a large floor plant in your home. The second plant I want to talk about today is actually the one that is always sitting next to me in my videos. So I'm going to pull it up real quick, but this is called a Natal Mahogany, or a Trichilea emetica, if I'm not mistaken, is the scientific name. But I love this plant. I am absolutely obsessed with this. I first saw these at TPIE last year, if I'm not mistaken, which is the Tropical Plant International Expo, which I went to last January for work, and I saw these and I absolutely fell in love with them. I just loved the vibe that they had. You can see it's very much like a woodlandy kind of plant. It definitely has much more of a northeastern feel than a tropical feel, which many of our houseplants have a harsh tropical feeling. So I was really looking for a large floor plant to put in the dead center of my home, but I wasn't really excited about putting just like a snake plant there, which I will not be talking about snake plants in this video because while they are great viable options for large floor plants, I just think I want to talk about other things other than snake plants today. So great plant, just not on this video today. But this Natal Mahogany is such an incredible plant for lower light conditions. I have this plant in the dead center of my apartment, as I'm basically sitting near the dead center of my apartment. This plant sits at least 8 feet away from the closest window, and that's pretty far away from a window for a plant's liking, but this plant I have found has given me no grief. Most importantly, I would say, is it's lost no leaves from the bottom. I'd say one of the things that happens when you bring large floor plants home, say a ficus, and if you put that fiddly ficus in a dark corner of your home, you're probably going to find that ficus is going to drop many leaves very quickly. That is not something that the Natal Mahogany does, and that is something that is so important to me because floor plants aren't cheap unless you're going to a big box store, and quite frankly, none of the cool, or at least most of the cool floor plants are not going to be at a big box store. So these cooler, more funky out there floor plants are usually, you know, they're not the most inexpensive thing. So when we bring these home, we want them to do well. We don't want them to fall apart like those $200 ficus trees. That happens a lot, and I don't like to hear about it at work. So don't get a ficus, get a Natal Mahogany if you're looking for a nice tree for your home. What I really love about this plant is how easy it is to grow. So I can kind of tell, it's probably not going to read on camera that well, but this plant is just ever so slightly droopy. So I can tell, particularly the leaf that's kind of been hanging over me in the video, at least in the past part of the video, I can tell it's a little bit dehydrated looking, and this plant could probably use a drink. When I used my moisture meter on this plant this morning, it read as a 2, and this plant definitely likes to stay a little bit more moist than that. I would say this plant could use a regular watering. If I was giving this plant water, like a full saturation, perhaps once every 7 to 10 days, I'm sure this plant would be very, very happy with me. But I find myself just quite literally taking this plant into the shower. It's still in its plastic nursery pot, although I have it staged in a large ceramic pot. I just take this plant to the shower, I throw it in there, I run some lukewarm water over the leaves and let it run into the soil just to clean off any dust, because I do have it in the dead center of my apartment. So I want it looking nice at all times. And give this plant a nice full drink, and I find that's exactly what this plant wants. So I'd say the worst thing you could do to a Natal Mahogany is to underwater it. I really, really love this plant, and I would highly recommend it to anybody who is looking for a reliable, large floor plant. And I do want to quickly address, I've gotten a lot of comments on my past videos regarding this plant saying that you guys have had a really hard time finding it, locating one. And I actually reached out to my plant broker, one of the ladies who ships me plants at the shop where I work, and I asked her, why are these so hard to come by? Because I don't have a problem. But she was telling me that there is one main grower out in Florida who grows Natal Mahoganies. He primarily grows them in 10-inch pots and 14-inch pots, and very, very, very rarely he releases some 6-inch braids, which, you know, smaller size braided plants similar to like a money tree. So these are only usually available through a plant broker. So if you are looking to get one at your local plant shop, I would just ask them if they order from any plant brokers and recommend that they keep an eye out for the Natal Mahoganies, because they're not going to find it through any of their local people. I can't find it through any of my local people. The only way I can order this plant is through my Florida plant broker. So that's my tip from me to you today about Natal Mahoganies, thanks to my plant broker. This plant kind of looks similar to the Natal Mahogany in a sense, but it is very different. This is a Schefflera actinophylla Amate, and this one is probably a more common one, I would say, kind of more close to the Monstera. You might be able to find this at a big box store if I'm not mistaken, but this is commonly referred to as an umbrella tree. Scheffleras are usually referred to as umbrella trees, and this is definitely a better option for brighter light if you're looking for a bright light plant. So this plant right here, if I'm at work and I have an office building come to me and they're looking for a lovely floor plant for their space, I ask them, is this going near a window or away from a window? And if the plant is going near a window, I always push them in the direction of this plant, and the plant, when it's away from a window, I will talk about next. But this plant, I will say, is super, super easy. I will say it just does prefer a little bit more light. I would say if you give this plant less light, it might behave more on the ends of a ficus, where if you put a ficus in low light, it might drop a few of its lower leaves. But this plant is not going to behave like a ficus where it just dies on you, at least in my experience. I've never had these die in my hands in my home or at the shop. And I quickly do want to say there is actually a new cultivar of this plant, Schefflera actinophylla, called Alpine, which is a more tighter columnar version, so it's a little bit less out there, as this is more of a bush. There'll be more of like a column, if you will. So that is definitely a very great viable option too, just like the Schefflera Amate. But the Schefflera arboricola, I find, is a little bit more of a difficult plant to take care of. The Schefflera arboricola is the smaller leaf Schefflera or umbrella tree, so I'm talking specifically today about the larger leaf Schefflera. I find that these plants are just very, very easy. They're truly tough as nails, but as long as you have the bright light, that is what you're looking for. So as far as watering goes, I'm not watering this plant very often at all. I'm probably giving this plant a good drink every 3 weeks or so, keeping in mind this plant is still in its plastic nursery pot, so it is holding on to moisture a little bit more than if I had it in a terracotta pot. You certainly want to be sure not to overwater this plant. I would say that's the one thing I would say about this plant. So or I guess the two things would be put it in bright light and don't overwater it, and I would say that's the secret to taking care of a Schefflera, specifically Schefflera Amate. One of the characteristics I really like about this plant is the petioles have a nice purple color to them, so it's kind of probably a little difficult to see, but the stems right here have a nice purple hue, and when they connect to the tree themselves, they have a nice purple hue to it, so I really like that. I really like purple, and I really like green, so I really love purple and green plants. It's not a very noticeable characteristic, but it's one of those nuances you notice when you have this plant in your own home, and it's something you really learn to appreciate. And another thing I really like about this plant is these trunks will get nice and woody. You can see my two are starting to get really woody now, at least at the base. So it will be like a full tree one day, if I'm not mistaken. And actually, I see this plant all over Philadelphia in lobbies, and they are usually quite large, and I can get these quite large at the shop if I get them in like a 14-inch pot. They're going to be like 6 feet tall at least, but this one right here is in an 8-inch pot, much more manageable for my space. It's about 2 or 3 feet tall, and I really enjoy this plant. Highly recommend it. Like I said, just be sure not to overwater it and to give it adequate light. On the opposite end of that light spectrum, I have a really good friend of mine here. This is Dracaena Janet Craig, and this plant is unkillable. I love this plant so much because I have this in one of the darkest corners in my home, and I literally do nothing to it. I probably watered this plant, I want to say maybe 3 or 4 times in the last almost year that I have had this plant. So it's very, very low maintenance. So as I kind of touched on when I was talking about the Schefflera, this is the plant that I recommend to office buildings if they are putting this plant in the dead center of a room that has no windows. It's just getting fluorescent lighting, as many offices do. So this is a plant that I always wholeheartedly recommend to them. And I always say about these, my care tips that I always tell them is, this plant does not like fluoride, so if you could avoid giving this plant tap water, I give this plant tap water because I'm not trying to upkeep it really. It's just a plant that I have in a corner, but off topic. So I would recommend giving this plant distilled water over tap water, and this plant requires very minimal water. These root systems on Dracaenas are very, very small. They are like the size of my fist usually, and they do not require a lot of water because they're holding onto their water for usually a good amount of time in my experience. So I usually tell the office buildings, go to your local convenience store once a month, buy a jug or gallon of distilled water, bring it back to the office, dump it in there once a month, and that's all you got to do. So that is literally how I recommend taking care of these plants. They're so incredibly easy, and I will say I'm specifically talking about Dracaena janicrae. Now, Dracaenas overall are very easy plants to care for. However, I do find a few of them are just like not very viable. Specifically, the most common one I would say is probably the corn plant, which is Dracaena fragrans. It has a very woody trunk, and the large strappy leaves, kind of similar to this. They have more like yellow and lime green accents to them. I find that those brown so quickly if they're not happy. They're just not the easiest plant to care for. But these Dracaena janicraes are incredibly easy. There are so many varieties of Dracaenas. There are a large amount of Dracaenas, I'm sure, that would be very viable for your home. But my favorite, and the one that I trust in any occasion and I wholeheartedly recommend to anybody, whether it's a client or a friend, it would be the Dracaena janicrae. So requires very minimal water. It does not want a lot of light. It will definitely burn if you give this plant too much light. So no light. I mean, not no light, but very, very minimal light. I have this one pulled off roughly 6 feet away from a south-facing window, but it's in a corner on the same wall as the window. So if you get what I'm saying, it's not receiving any of that light. It's just sitting in a brightly lit room. So really, really low maintenance. Highly, highly recommend these. I would say the only thing is that I'm noticing is I probably should be dusting these leaves more often because it's sitting in a darker corner in my home, and I'm definitely not paying attention to it very often at all. So I will definitely give this plant a good dusting as soon as I'm done filming today. Last but certainly not least, I'm going to talk about Aspidistras, or cast iron plants. Now, cast iron plants are a plant that was definitely really popular back in the houseplant craze in the 70s. These are known for being foolproof plants, similar to the Dracaena or, for example, a ZZ plant. These plants are known for just being able to take benign neglect. However, I would say these plants definitely require more than benign neglect. I would say you need to water your cast iron plants roughly every 2 or 3 weeks for them to stay happy. I have found when I am not consistently watering them, that's when I'm getting these brown tips, as you can see. It's not the most attractive thing, especially on a plant that doesn't grow that fast. So learn from my mistakes. But you definitely don't want to overwater this plant. I'd say if you were watering a cast iron plant more than once a week, it might be a little bit too much for its liking. I keep this particular Aspidistra roughly 10 feet away from a south-facing window, so while it is in a brightly lit room, it is by no means in a bright location. So this plant is not receiving bright light, and as I mentioned, I'm watering this plant. This one right here, I'm probably watering it every 2 to 3 weeks, I'd say. I usually just throw it in the shower and give it a good drink, quite frankly. I find that's kind of what it seems to like, and similar to the Natal Mahogany, I find that these leaves get dusty very quickly or very easily, so I find that the shower is just a really easy way for me to water this plant and not have to worry about cleaning off every single leaf, because there is like 100 leaves on this plant, so I'm not going to deal with that. But a ridiculously easy plant. I would say the only downfall about these plants in particular is their price. They usually have a large sticker price. These plants are notorious for being slow growers, which is why they cost so much money. Whether it's a wholesale price or a retail price, it's always higher than I would like it to be. So that's the one thing I'll say about these plants, but you can absolutely find them for good deals. I can't say I'd recommend dropping 100 plus on an Aspidistra, because they're not going to do as much for your space as some of these other plants, but the reason I would like to highlight them today is because they are such an excellent plant for those spaces in your home that just aren't receiving that much light, but you really want to have a nice plant there. And for example, a snake plant might just not be what you're looking for. You might be looking for some more foliage. So highly recommend Aspidistra. Not necessarily as large as the other plants I talked about. This plant is not going to get much taller than this plant right here. I'd say this plant could probably max out maybe a foot taller than this, but I'd say 4 feet maximum is as tall as this plant's going to get. Well, most of the other plants I talked about today can continuously grow up to your ceiling. So that is one last thing I will point out. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for joining me today. I'll leave a list in the description of all 5 of these plants for you guys to see, and I would also love to hear from you guys what you guys would recommend as a large floor plant, as I only have room for maybe 10 floor plants in my home, so I only have a few of them, and I can only recommend the ones that I have growing in my home. So thank you guys again for watching. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at phillyfoliage, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys in my next video. Have a great day!